Hello, I'm Linda Graham, author of Resilience, Powerful Practices for Bouncing Back from Disappointment, Difficulty, and even Disaster. In this series of conversations on resilience, you will learn from many experts offering practices that help them recover their own resilience. In this conversation with Chris Germer, we're learning the yin-yang quality of mindful self-compassion, both being with our experiences and taking action in the world, to give ourselves permission to ask, what do I need? And also to say no to harm, to protect and provide for ourselves. So welcome to this conversation, exploring resources for recovering resilience. Today, I'm talking with Chris Germer, who is the co-developer and co-pioneer with Kristen Neff of the Mindful Self-Compassion Program and co-author of the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook, A Proven Way to Accept Yourself, Build Inner Strengths, and Thrive, published in 2018, and co-author of Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, a guide for professionals, to be published in 2019. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Thank you, Linda. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. So I met Chris at a mindfulness and compassion conference and participated in an initial MSc teacher training program. And I've come to know and deeply trust Chris's commitment to bring self-compassion practices to people all over the world, in his trainings all over the world, through his previous books, like The Mindful Path of Self-Compassion, through his practice as a clinical psychologist, specializing in compassion-based psychotherapy, and through his teaching in psychiatry part-time at Harvard Medical School. So Chris is the real deal. And I'm so grateful that you're here with us today, Chris.
Oh, thank you for saying that.
So if we're exploring how mindful self-compassion practices can help people become more resilient, and if we see resilience as capacities to face and deal with life's challenges and being able to cope well and skillfully with ordinary disappointment and even extraordinary disaster, how do these practices of mindful self-compassion help people do that, help them be resilient?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, the research on self-compassion, and there are now over 1,600 studies in the peer-reviewed academic journals. In one word, if someone were to ask, what does the research say? It basically says that self-compassion improves emotional resilience.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so if nothing else, that's what it does. It does it in a number of ways. One way is through changing our physiology. As Paul Gilbert talks about different subsystems in the autonomic nervous system, and we have a threat state and a care state. So when we move from a threat to a care state, we are usually in a position then to begin to heal. So it does that. But there are just so many different psychological mechanisms. We haven't worked out the physiological or the neurological mechanisms, but research is underway in that area.
So do you have a specific example of when you or someone you know was coping with something difficult and something from the Mindful Self-Compassion Protocol was helpful at the time to do that?
Well, last week, we totaled our car.
Oh, Chris.
Yeah.
Were you or Claire hurt?
Yeah, so we both got banged up, but the car was totaled. And, and it occurred because of error. That is to say, Claire was driving. I distracted her. She went through a red light and somebody hit us. And in self-compassion, there are three main components to self-compassion. The first one is mindfulness, which is to know when we're suffering while we're suffering. This is a moment of suffering. This hurts. It sure did. I didn't realize traffic accidents were so hard,
Yeah.
They're hard. It's like metal on metal. But anyhow, after we, realized that we were both physically okay and could walk around and the car didn't blow up or anything, I did practice self-compassion. The first thing was to simply acknowledge that a terrible thing had happened. You know, this hurts. This is hard. This is really painful. And I also felt a little embarrassed about it because it was our fault. And you know, you're not supposed to run red lights. So, but we did. And the second part of self-compassion is common humanity. In other words, a sense of I'm not alone. And I really brought to mind in a conscious way, you know, first of all, this is the first accident either of us have had in 35 years, but it's not the first accident that anybody has ever had. We are not alone, and we don't only do this when we're distracted, and other people run through red lights. It's not a crime per se, it just happens, and it's unfortunate. So that second part, common humanity, kind of alleviated some of the shame that I felt about that. And self-criticism and rebuke. And then the third part, self-kindness, the third component, mindfulness and humanity. And self-kindness was basically realizing that my body was traumatized, my mind was traumatized, also my wife, you know, and that we needed to care for ourselves. We needed to care for each other. We needed to care for ourselves, which means I didn't do anything else that day. I also shared it with others, what had happened. They were super sympathetic, just as you are right now. Listening to this, I appreciate that, Linda. And also, so taking really good care of the body and mind. So the third component of self-compassion, self-kindness is really asking yourself the question, what do I need? You know, we would ask somebody we care about, what do you need? Asking myself, what do I need? What do I need? You know, physically, what do I need emotionally? Some other subcategories of what we need are, what do we need to comfort ourselves, soothe ourselves, validate ourselves, but also action things. What do I need to protect myself, provide for myself, take necessary action, motivate myself? The general category of self-kindness. So that was a pretty recent opportunity to practice. I think it really helped. Of course, I'd been practicing for 10, 12 years before that, so I had a little head of steam going. But
well, that would lead me to my next question, and I certainly send you and Claire a lot of compassion for what has happened and what you're having to cope with. Can these practices be cultivated ahead of time so that they're ready to draw upon when an emergency happens?
Yeah, so definitely, you know, mind and heart training can be done all the time. And I particularly like meditation as a way of preparing. Basically, meditation is kind of focused practice. That's a formal meditation. And then we have informal meditation, which is daily life practice. What I just described to you after the accident was daily life practice.
Right.
There are also meditations. So in the Mindful Self-Compassion Training Program, we have 3 core meditations. We have 4 other meditations, all of which can be practiced. In other words, often self-compassion is really about giving ourselves permission to include ourselves in the circle of compassion, giving ourselves permission to slip ourselves in to the compassion that we feel, and also reminding ourselves. So when we practice in a formal or an informal way, we are doing this again and again. We're giving ourselves permission and we're reminding ourselves so that it becomes a habit.
So do you have a particular practice that has become a go-to habit that you can pretty much rely on was going to show up without even having to think about it when you're needing to practice self-compassion?
So it really depends on the situation. Something like what I described with the accent, my go-to practice is just a hand over the heart, you know, just feeling the touch and the warmth of the hand and just leaving it there. And it's kind of, it's a simple physical way of directing kindness toward oneself whenever you need it. It's really fast and effective. In meditation, I practice in a variety of ways, but I think in interaction with other people, the main practice that I have is what we call giving and receiving compassion, which is when
Mm-hmm.
somebody's really struggling, say,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm a therapist and I'm often in that kind of situation, to breathe when the body breathes in, to breathe in for myself, and when the body breathes out, to breathe out for the other person. So to connect with my own experience with the in breath, connect with another person with the out breath. And I also do that in meditation. It's
Mm-hmm.
a very nice daily life practice, just like hands on the heart,
Yeah.
tracking the breath, breathing in for oneself, breathing out for others.
Right. Is there anything that you would recommend if you or someone gets kind of stuck and they're not really finding their way to that opening to resilience again? Is there anything to dig deeper that could help out then?
Oh, yeah. I think the simplest thing is just trying to remind ourselves to ask ourselves, what do I need?
Okay.
I think the two best, you might say, micro practices that we can often slip in the door, even if there's not a lot of room,
Right, right.
is to ask ourselves, what do I need? I mean, we could even put a post-it on our computers or near the kitchen or wherever, ask, what do I need?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
people don't usually ask us this, but we
No.
can ask this of ourselves. I think that's key. And also, I think a physical touch. Those two I would consider
Mm-hmm.
kind of micro practices that
Mm-hmm.
we can use almost any time, and they do manage to kind of change the channel a little bit, at least to redirect the attention when it's necessary toward ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a couple minutes left here. Do you have any additional insights or even questions about resilience and mindful self-compassion? I mean, are there things that people might not necessarily think of in terms of mindful self-compassion and resilience?
I think that usually when people think of self-compassion, they think of nurturing.
Mm-hmm.
And when they think of compassion in general, they think of nurturing.
Mm-hmm.
But um, I think there are two sides to compassion. One is a more being with quality, and the other is a more action in the world quality, what
Mm-hmm.
Neff and I are calling the yin and the yang of self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think that some people, they don't kind of think they think they may not resonate with self-compassion because they think it's all about nurturing, and nurturing is super important, but it's also about action in the world. And
Yeah.
so I think it's just really important to recognize that to have the capacity to say no to harm, no to the harm that's being caused to us, or
Mm-hmm.
that we may cause to ourselves, to say no to that, to provide for ourselves, and also to motivate ourselves to do the right thing. And when we're knocked down in
Mm-hmm.
life, um, we need to comfort and care for ourselves, but we also need to get up on the horse and ride. And so, how does
Mm-hmm.
one get on the horse and ride? I
Right,
think
right.
self-compassion can do that when we remember that it's about protecting from harm, providing for ourselves, and also motivating ourselves to do things that sometimes are difficult, but motivating ourselves with kindness rather
Mm-hmm.
than,
Mm-hmm. Right, right.
you know,
Yeah.
you know.
Oh, beautiful. Chris, thank you so much for sharing your time and sharing your wisdom. And all of these interviews will be archived on my website, lindagraham-mft.net. May they be useful to you and yours.